Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Well, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning in. And today we have Mike Clawson with us today. And I just had the privilege of meeting Mike just a month ago at the Wild Goose Festival. And it was my first experience at the Wild Goose Festival as well. So I drove from Kansas City to North Carolina because I wanted to take my gravel bike because I wanted to ride in the Appalachian Mountains while I was there. And I only got one good bike ride in while I was there. But, and Brian McLaren had encouraged me to go. So I knew nobody at this Wild Goose Festival except for Brian. And now I met several people. Mike, I enjoyed meeting you. Mike is the director. I'm not sure the exact title.
Administrator
for a organization called Illumin. And we're going to get to that here in a minute. But it is an organization, I guess, that Richard Rohr started about in 2012. Is that right?
That's right.
That worked with concepts of men's rites of passage and stuff like that. So we're going to get to like men's spirituality, men's rites of passage, false masculinity a little bit here in a minute. But first, I want to get some of your story, Mike. So thanks for joining us at Spirituality Adventure.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm glad to be with you, Fred. Good to see you again.
You too. So tell us where you were born. I just assumed you were a Texas guy, but now we chatted a little bit and I learned you're not a Texas kid, right?
No, I think there's a saying down here. I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here as soon as I could. I'm a Midwestern boy from the Great Lakes region. So I actually miss the part of the country that has actual seasons and not just 9-month long summer. But I was born in Ohio, Northwest Ohio, and then I moved to Michigan pretty quick. And spent my teen years in northern rural Michigan, northern Lower Peninsula. My dad was a director at a Baptist Bible camp up there. So and then I went to college in the Chicago area. And got stuck there for about 12 years in the suburbs of Chicago. So just all over the Great Lakes region.
Yeah, where'd you go to college?
Went to Wheaton College, which likes to describe itself as an evangelical flagship sort of institution. Sometimes they call themselves rather amusingly to me, the Harvard of Christian colleges, which I think is kind of funny because I'm pretty sure Harvard's not over there calling itself, the Wheaton of secular colleges or anything. But it was academically rigorous, but also deeply, deeply evangelical. And at the time, very enamored with, C.S. Lewis. We called him St. Jack. Very enamored with, it was a good place for who I was at the time. And it would definitely not be a fit for me these days. Right.
Am I wrong? Was Jim Elliot somehow tied to Wheaton?
Yeah. Jim Elliot, the missionary that was murdered or killed by some indigenous tribe that he was trying to evangelize down in South America. And then his wife, Elizabeth Elliot, who a lot of young Christian women have unfortunately read her books, ended up writing his story and about a lot of other things. So he was an alumni. So was Billy Graham.
I was thinking Billy Graham went there. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, there's one of the big buildings is the Billy Graham Center. It houses a museum to Billy's crusades and evangelistic work, as well as the fundraising, the development office. Yeah. So maybe apropos, I'm not sure.
There's a guy named John Walton that is Old Testament. I've worked on a lot of degrees myself. I was working on a PhD in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
and ran across Walton. I kind of like some of his work on the ancient Near East. And
I have one of his books on my shelf over here.
Oh, yeah. And then I'm trying to think, I've done a lot of work with the Arab Muslim world and used to help host the Middle East suite at the National Prayer Breakfast. And
nice.
One of the board members at Wheaton actually was involved with us in the Middle East world. He was a doctor named, oh man, I'm going to blank on his name now. Oh well. Anyway, it'll come to me 30 minutes from now. So,
well, if you're looking for good other ex-Whedon folks to interview, I don't know if you've had Larisha Hawkins on the podcast before, but she was the professor that got pushed out of Whedon for showing solidarity with Muslims and wearing hijab or posting a picture of her hijab on a social media or something, and it was a whole big deal. Yeah, national news. But Larisha's a fantastic scholar and has a lot of good things to say. So look her up as well.
Check her out. Yeah. All right. So tell us you've got a lot of education. Give us your education track and how that has evolved into, kind of where you're at now spiritually.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm kind of a weirdo in the sense that for me, the life of the mind and intellectual pursuits and philosophical questions are deeply wrapped up with my spirituality. Ideas are spiritual to me. They're not just abstract. They're not separate from practice or ethics or any of the rest of it. I remember having spiritual experiences as an undergrad, reading Thomas Aquinas, out on the front lawn of Wheaton, being moved so deeply just by this abstract medieval philosophy. So,
scholastics moving people.
I know, right? Well, people don't realize Aquinas himself was a mystic, and he spent the last decade of his life not writing theology, but just as a contemplative, pursuing kind of a mystical vision of the divine. So, I can relate to that.
That's good.
That's sort of my own path is from, scholastic pursuits to contemplative pursuits. And, but yeah, so I want to say that in preface to say that, my educational pedigree is deeply wrapped up in my own spirituality. I did philosophy undergrad at Wheaton, along with a double major in Christian ed. I stayed there and did a master's degree in missions and intercultural studies because I thought I wanted to go start churches in Europe. That never happened, but I did end up as a youth pastor in the Chicago suburbs, and then a church planter, and then left that to go back to school and get a master's in theology at a liberal mainline Presbyterian school.
Were you planting with a particular group when you
just with a real small Midwest denomination called the Churches of God General Conference? So not the Pentecostal Churches of God, but just a sort of middle of the road evangelical group. But
Cleveland Church of God Anderson.
Nope.
Either one. Okay.
It's the Anderson Church of God split off from the one that I was a part of. The Anderson folks were the holiness movement ones, and mine was the Second Great Awakening ones. So Charles Finney era kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I found them mostly because they had some money to give, and they had a vision for planting innovative, what at the time we were calling emerging churches. I was a part of this emerging church movement, which was mostly post-evangelicals rethinking theology, spirituality, ministry practices, all of the things, church polity.
What year was this?
This was mid 2000s. So
this has been the Doug Padgett, Brian McLaren crowd. Even the Wild Goose crowd to some degree emerged out of that, don't you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, the Wild Goose was in its origin a emerging church event.
Okay.
It was envisioned and conceptualized and planned by all those emerging folks. And then it's kind of taken on its life of its own as that movement dwindled and turned into other things.
Yeah.
But I like to say that just like the dinosaurs didn't actually die out, they just evolved into birds. The emerging church movement didn't die out. It just evolved into wild geese and other things. So,
An alligator. No,
yeah.
I'm just crocodile.
Yeah. So no, McLaren, Brian's a good friend of mine. He's a mentor from way back. Doug's a friend. All those guys, we were all collaborators on all kinds of projects back in the day. My little piece of it was to help create cohorts around the country, help people find each other. That needed to talk about these things.
Yeah.
These days we might call them theology pubs. Back then we were calling them cohorts.
Yeah. I was, I'm just getting to know some of these people this really recently. Right.
Yeah.
But, and just came to Richard Rohr in the fall of 2019. The first Richard Rohr book I read was in the fall of 2019. And this was in the kind of the aftermath of my, just kind of my whole world getting turned upside down. Mm-hmm. But I told Doug Paget, we were talking, and I said, I tried to get into one of those early leadership networks things that he was putting together, but I was too old.
Huh. You weren't a young leader at the time, huh?
Right. Yeah, I was 40 and I was too old. So like you had to be born, I think. I told Doug, I said, I tried to get in, but like I was born in 61, and I think the cutoff was you had to be born in 64 or later.
That's too strict. I think anyone born after 60 is a Gen Xer. So, you should have counted.
Well, Doug took credit for it. He said, I made that rule. I said, okay, well, that's why I'm just now getting to know you, Doug.
Your whole story could have been different if only he had let you in.
Oh man, he might have saved me. Who knows? I mean, right? Yeah,
I mean, my involvement in that movement kind of both saved and ruined me in different ways. Yeah. But no, so to finish the narrative about my studies, did theology at Austin Presbyterian Seminary, and then went on from there to Baylor to do my PhD in religion and church history specifically, and I basically wrote a history of that emerging church movement.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Where it came from, what it was influenced by, how it started, where it went.
Yeah. And just for our listeners, most everybody knows I'm a Baylor grad, and that, and obviously Baylor sports has had a lot to cheer about these last 3 years.
How's it go? Sikkim? Is that the?
Yeah. Right. I mean, RG3, like you being there only for PhD, you didn't really have maybe the whole immersion into the Baylor sports world, right?
No, because I was commuting from Austin at the time too. So I was
Yeah. So that's what happens is PhD students don't always drink the Kool-Aid, but
especially not when you're in your 30s doing your PhD. You're there for a purpose and you're kind of laser focused.
Yeah. But I drank the Kool-Aid. So I've always been a Baylor fan sport wise. And of course we got a great female basketball team. Cheering for Brittany Griner right now to get back out of Russia and back home to America. And then I'm also a big, of course we won we won the NCAA championship. I'm a huge college basketball fan. And and the Baylor football team did great last year, right? I mean, it was amazing. So it's a good time to be a Baylor fan. But here's the thing I wanted to say is that we found out that my church history professor when I was at Baylor was your dissertation director.
Yep. Bill Pitts.
Dr. Bill Pitts.
Been around forever. I think he just retired. Well-deserved retirement.
He must have been just like a year older than me when I was in his classes, maybe.
He might have been. He might have just been fresh out of Vanderbilt. One of the most kindest, generous, and really excellent scholars that I've had the privilege of working with. And a dear friend.
Yeah, I took. I probably took an introduction to church history class with him. Probably I know I took Catholic history with him, and then I also probably took a Reformation class with him, something like that. Yeah.
I had to teach some of those intro to church history classes as part of my, when I was a grad student, and 60 Baylor freshmen, wide-eyed, having their minds blown as I, explained to them how the story of Christianity is way more complicated than they were led to believe. And that was so much fun. That was my favorite part of teaching, was getting to work with those freshmen in those intro kind of classes.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't get that in Baptist Sunday school class.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I had a 2 chalkboard long flow chart of the all the Trinitarian doctrines and how they evolved. And I'm pretty sure none of the students remember any of it now, but they will remember the flow chart. At least they will remember how big and complicated it was just for the early church to sort out this thing called the Trinity.
Yeah.
So
and it turns out a couple of Cappadocian dudes were drinking beer and figured it out. No, anyway, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, they got the right answer. Like once and for all, somehow those guys must have been the beer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we won't dwell on that right now. But
all right. We're getting off topic.
Yeah. So, what after you did your PhD, kind of how did you land at Illumin? And let's kind of sort of get to Illumin. I want to talk about some of that stuff.
Yeah. I'll have to cut out a bunch of stuff that happened in between, but that's fine. Because the story with Illumin for me is that being raised in conservative evangelical culture and eventually moving out of that, but also being raised in rural, small town, northern Michigan, where ideas of masculinity were very stereotyped. It was hunting, fishing, fighting, working on your truck. It was, and if you weren't into those things, you weren't really, a real man, as it were. It was in some ways kind of violent and threatening. There was fights and threats and things happening all the time. And as a geeky kid, I was a target of that. And so I never felt at home in sort of stereotypical masculine culture. And even when I moved into more, educated evangelical circles, they were still reading, Wild at Heart and books like that kind of still presented a very narrow, specific view of this is what it means to be a man once and for all. Here's the formula. And it just never fit. It didn't work for me because, I was, like I said, I was more into the life of the mind. I was more, in that internal life, more aware of my emotions, for whatever reason, more egalitarian. I would take care of my kids when they were little and change their diapers. And my Texas in-laws just thought that blew their minds that a father would do that. That's not, the dad's job. Why would I change diapers? But that was just kind of how I was raised, I guess. I had parents I had a strong mother who, was in some ways a leader in the family, and definitely a leader in the church. The women that I worked at the camp where I was raised, the Baptist Bible camp, we had strong kind of horse wrangler women. I was a horse wrangler. So I don't know. I was surrounded by those examples that the gender stereotypes didn't fit and didn't fit me. And so when I got to Austin, sorry, I'm trying to give you the short version here. When I got to Austin, I stumbled across these guys that were part of this thing called the Mankind Project. And MKP basically was a corollary or an offshoot of the feminist movement. They said women are doing their work. They're getting in touch with, their true selves and liberating themselves from the shackles of the past. Men need something like this too. And so guys like Robert Bly and Robert Moore and some of these writers that were writing, the Myth of Iron John, or writing about these archetypes of masculine archetypes. They started mostly based on Jungian psychology. They started creating immersion experiences, initiation experiences, rites of passage to help give men an experience of going inward and doing that inner work that we're not very good at doing. We might call it spiritual work, or if you want to, or just psychological, inner work. And it was transformative for me to go through that, to be around men who were doing that and who were encouraging that, who were, the kinds of guys that you could be real and authentic with, the kinds of guys that you could sit around and talk about your feelings and your relationships instead of sports and, hunting or whatever. And that was revolutionary for me to find other men like that. And it changed me, being a part of it. The same time that, a little bit after Mankind Project was doing its thing, Richard Rohr, this Franciscan spiritual mystic teacher, was also starting his own sort of men's experiences back in the 90s, men's rites of passage. He started with younger boys, realized real fast that young men need elders to mentor them, and that we hadn't raised up a generation of elders. And so he kind of shifted and focused on doing both, doing young men and focusing on elders. And so these rites of passage, they're not just for guys in their 20s or whatever, they're for guys of all ages, and often skews older, second half of life kind of guys that have built their tower and built up all the ego stuff, and then realized it's not actually as meaningful as I thought it was. And there's what Richard calls the path of dissent. Not just Richard, I mean, this is kind of common to most spiritualities, right? That there's the path of ascent, where you're kind of building your ego, feeling your power, and these are good and necessary things, to find your identity, to define your boundaries, healthy ego formation. But there comes a point in your life where you realize, like, you're going to die, that your life isn't all about you, that you're not as, strong or as awesome as you've been projecting this whole time, those elevator pitch versions of yourself. And so that you reach that tipping point, and you can either embrace that realization, or you can fight it, or you can ignore it. And the path of healthy spirituality and healthy men's work is to embrace that path of dissent and to start to let go of some of those ego things. So when I came across Lumen, I had been hearing about Lumen for years through Richard's work and through some mutual friends that work for the CAC, Richard's organization, the Center for Action and Contemplation. And so an opportunity came to work for Lumen and to help as their administrator, and it was perfect fit, because it jived with what the work I'd already been doing in Mankind Project. It jived with this kind of open approach to spirituality. And it was meeting me kind of right at the, I'm early 40s. So I'm, just at the end of first half of life stuff, and just starting to think about second half of life stuff. And so beginning to need to reckon with that path of dissent, and what does that look like, and what does it mean, and where are there mentors and guides that can show the way and provide some opportunities to learn how to do that well. So that's the short version of how I got involved in Lumen and why.
Yeah. I'm curious. I remember reading Iron John when it came out, which I'm trying to think back. Was that like early 90s maybe, or late 80s?
I want to say 80s. Yeah. Sometime in the 80s.
Late 80s. And I remember liking it, and then I remember out of that, there became different movements around this idea of male initiation rites. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm thinking backwards and trying to think of stuff that but I remember, the idea that our American culture had kind of lost any kind of initiation. I mean, maybe like right. Jewish culture maybe still had bar mitzvahs. If you're in like mainline Christian churches, you might do confirmation, but it wasn't specifically masculine.
Right.
I remember, maybe it was drinking or having sex or driving a car was male initiation in the masculine world of American teenage, whatever.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we romanticize that, don't we? Sometimes, like, guys have sex and, you become a man, or, you get a car, or take the road trip, ever since the Beat Poets, going on the road and taking the Great American Road Trip. That's we're desperate to create these sort of rites of initiation. Sometimes we come up with them for ourselves in lieu of the ones that society used to have for us. But it's been a good 100 years or more since we really had anything like that in masculine and for men in society, and for women too. I mean, women need this too, but they, the way that, I mean, I'm not a gender essentialist, and I get real kind of itchy when we start talking in strict terms of masculine, feminine, men and women, so I'm not saying this is true across the board for all women, men or all women, but I think right. The way that our society has socialized women, the way that our society has socialized men, there are often different needs that women sometimes have those experiences whether they're biological through menstruation, whether they're or childbirth, or whether they're social in terms of friends groups and social groups, that women are often better, more immersed in those things, whereas men, we tend to be more isolated, and we tend to be more loners, and we tend not to have those rights, those markers in our life that now you're a man, now you're whatever. And the reality is, whether it has to do with testosterone or whatever, like, men want challenge. Men typically want to feel their strength, to feel their power, and to push back against something, to be challenged, to test it against something. And that's part of both the building up of the ego, but also the tearing it down a little bit. And it's important. It's important to tear down that ego a little bit. Otherwise, we become assholes, and we become toxic men, and we become the kind of guys that, don't know how to treat others with respect and compassion and gentleness. So in order to be gentlemen, to be nurturing men, to be men that are healthy and whole and well-rounded, and that can embrace both their masculine and feminine energies, we actually need these kinds of rites of passage that that soften up the hard parts of us and toughen up the parts that need to be toughened up. And so in the past, these rites of passage were physical, demanding, go out into the woods, have a spirit vision, starve yourself, take psychedelics, something, hunt, kill an animal. These days, the challenge is more internal and spiritual. That's the part that we struggle with. And so the challenge is to face your core wounds and your authentic self, that thing that we hide from all the time with our busyness, with our toys and distractions and social media and work and ambitions. And we don't ever stop and just confront the man that's inside. And so that's the work that needs to be done. That's the challenge that requires that strength and that testing. Mm-hmm. At least that's the theory anyway. That's the idea.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep asking just some questions around this. So I vaguely remember when this Iron John thing came out, there were, and I don't want to divide this too heavily, but there were different groups of men's work that tied onto that, and then tried to develop their own versions of male initiation. So you had did Sam Harris actually work with a men's movement thing years ago?
Did he? He might have.
Or am I wrong? I could be wrong about that, but there was somebody that initiated one that was connected to the guy. Is it Bly that wrote Iron John?
Yeah.
There were, for lack of a better word, there were some secular versions of that where guys would go out into the woods and howl in the dark, and I don't know what all they did. I did never go on one of those.
Yeah, but Mankind Project is one of those that grew out of it. I think there's a few other organizations that do similar things.
And then the evangelical world picked it up a little bit, and then they tried to kind of do their versions of male initiation. And you happen to mention Wild at Heart, and so what's funny is I think like you do now, in that the masculine feminine language, breaks down, right, in all kinds of ways. Right. But I still think that so many of us are socialized, and then to what extent there's genetics and chemistry behind any of that, whatever. Right. I don't want to try to pop that bubble or analyze it too much, but I would just say that Wild at Heart would have been more of a masculine version that was more of an evangelical version. Yep. And I'm fairly, I've been into sports, rock climbing, mountain biking, extreme sports, but I'm also a kind of a geeky. I've always been studying. I've always been getting degrees, and so I've got that intellectual side too. But when I read Wild at Heart, to me, it was just like how I'd lived my life, basically. I didn't, and no revelations went on for me because I'd been doing most of that shit all my life.
It's funny. When I read it too, I resonated with it at the time. And oddly, I was the only guy in my group of guys that was reading it that did resonate. And it was mostly because I had grown up in the woods in northern Michigan and I had done some of that outdoor adventurous type stuff.
Yeah.
But the guys that I was with were musicians and, and lawyers and that wasn't who they were as men. That wasn't their identity. And so they're like, yeah, no, I don't understand what he's talking about, and that's, so at the time, maybe it did fit me, but I was thankfully in this group of guys that woke me up to the fact that, but it doesn't fit all of us. And this is just one way of being a guy. So I'm not saying there isn't some good stuff there. It was meaningful to me at the time. I just realized there was so much more. There's not one way to be a man. There's, if anything, these movements are about liberating us to be whoever we're supposed to be.
Yeah. So let's use a term that may be too loaded, but like when you think about what you've working with Illumin as it relates to any of those versions of male passage stuff. Okay. Like the term false masculinity, what does that mean anything to you? Is there such a thing as that? Are there versions of masculinity in our world today that we're like going are toxic? I mean, I have my views, but I want to hear yours. And especially as it relates to the work you're doing as well.
I think so. I think there are toxic forms of masculinity. I would say toxic masculinity is the result of traumatized masculinity, that there's a wound that all people have, men and women and anyone else, that is caused by patriarchy. And by patriarchy, I mean that social system in which men are placed at the top and given more power and more privilege by default, as if it's, a God ordained way that things ought to be, or whether that's, given religious justification or whether that's given, pseudoscientific justification for why men should be in charge. But that system, which, let's be honest, has persisted in most cultures throughout most of recorded human history, so thousands and thousands of years of enculturation of patriarchy, that damages people because it's not, well, it's just frankly false. It's just not the case that men are supposed to be in charge of everything, and that
I have a fine right to be an asshole.
Right. Yeah. Or even if you're, a benevolent ruler, you're still the ruler. And the thing is, it's clear to see how that system damages women and non-binary folks and folks that fall outside of the gender binary, but it's also damaging to men. And that's the thing that I came to realize, is that I had been damaged by those stereotypes, by that kind of toxic version of masculinity. And I call it traumatized because if you've ever read Bell Hooks, the late Bell Hooks, who just passed earlier this year,
I have.
African-American womanist writer, fantastic writer. Love her book. She has a book called All About Love. Excellent book. There's also a book that I just picked up.
I'm writing it down.
Here it is. This is one I'm reading next. The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love by Bell Hooks.
Spell that. Is it H-O-O?
Yeah, H-O-O-K-S. And it's lowercase. Her name is lowercase. So whenever you're writing it out, make sure you do it lowercase.
Okay.
And she says in here, she talks in here about the ways the patriarchy has harmed men because it keeps us from being able to tap into and express our feelings. That from very young ages, we're told to push those things down, to toughen up, to man up. Men, boys don't cry, all of that stuff. And it's bullshit. And it's a very particular type of masculine culture because there are cultures, where men are very emotionally expressive and men do cry. I mean, you think of the stereotypes of Latin culture, or you think of like, a passionate, sensuous Italian kind of guy, like for sure that guy cries. Or like, I have a friend who's, Irish roots. And he says, in Irish culture, you're allowed to cry, but only when you're drunk. And I don't know if that was tongue in cheek, but it seemed true to his experience. So, Bell writes about just that the damage, the trauma that's done to men when we're forced to not be our true selves, when we're forced to just cut out that whole part of ourselves. We might call it the feminine part of ourselves, or we might just call it the unrealized masculine, the nurturing and gentle and emotive sides of the masculine. And so, the toxic masculinity comes from traumatized masculinity, those wounds that we've been given from early on that say you can't be your true self, you can't feel what you're feeling, you need to stuff it down, you need to lie about it, hide it, ignore it until sometime later in life it bubbles up and explodes and wrecks things.
Yeah, I mean, that's me.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, like growing up, I'm very committed Jesus follower, always studying scripture, started a church, built a church, grew a church, taught people. But like if I had a negative emotion or thoughts that I didn't think were very godly, my approach was always to try to fight those. If they were sexual thoughts, like every man's battle, that whole world, and or to suppress it, or to redirect it, or to ignore it, but always a battle, right? With just thoughts and emotions that I didn't feel like were appropriate for a pastor Jesus follower, and I had a lot of self-discipline, so I succeeded a long time in at least holding all that at bay, but there were things as I got older that weren't going well in my own personal life. And one of them was sleep. I say now the two things got me in trouble. I wanted to sleep and I wanted to have sex. And so I had this, I was just in some really interesting situations. I started trying to treat my sleep problem. And then I ended up on Xanax, and then I ended up on adding alcohol in. And then I ended up having very little self-discipline over things that I had suppressed for a long, long time.
Yeah. Willpower will get you a long way, but it eventually is going to break down.
Yeah. It blew up under the influence of Xanax and alcohol, but then I had to go back and relook at all of, why did that blow up? And, through meditation, I've tried to view all of my emotions, all of my thoughts openly and curiously.
Yeah.
Without judgment, and try to learn from them or try to integrate or try to whatever, whereas before it caused a battle that I do think caused a bit of a false self. I tried to be as vulnerable as I could be when I was a pastor. I wasn't always the hero of all my stories. I always tried to be self-deprecating, but still your church grows and you're up speaking in front of people all the time, and people have an image of you that doesn't match reality. And, I was trying to maintain some form of quote godliness.
That's where that false self comes from, isn't it? When right. All of those parts of ourselves that we just push to the side and we try to ignore. I mean, in Jungian psychology, they call it the shadow.
Yeah.
And it's, but it's still there. And until you notice it, until you pay attention to it and try to see the shadow, so that, it's that.
I feel like okay, this is me.
Yeah.
And so how do I receive that? How do I live with that in a healthy way? That's been that's been a lot of the stuff. And Roar certainly helped me. The first book I read of Roar's in 2019, when I was feeling like an atheist and felt like I'd lost my faith and felt like maybe I didn't want to live anymore. Somebody sent me a hard copy of Falling Upward. And then I started kind of just reading as much of him as I could, because it kind of got my faith off the ventilator.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So I've been reading Roar, and then I finally got to the point where it's like, I'm going to try to meet Richard. And then that led me to Brian, and that led me to Wild Goose. And now here I'm talking to you. Right.
Fantastic.
But so
Well, if you're ever so inclined, I invite you to come try out one of our men's rites of passage weekends. I think you'll find it a powerful experience.
Tell folks there might be people listening. You've got to I noticed you got one coming up here pretty soon.
Yeah, we got a couple. We got one in Texas in October, and then another in Northern California. I think also in October. So last 2 of this year, and then we'll have more coming up next year. But we do them all over the country, and it's like a 4-day immersive, out in nature, but not too rustic. It's not like it's not like a wilderness survival experience. For my MROP, we stayed in cabins. It's centered more around contemplative spirituality and ritual. And so it's designed to kind of take you through a path of descent. And I can't say too much about the specifics, just because it would ruin the experience if you knew too much of what was coming. You kind of need to come in with a beginner's mind. But it's rituals, it's dramas, it's practices, it's time alone in nature. It's time to work through grief. It's a time to work through that false self and those core wounds that create that false self, and then learn how to release and let go of some of that. Yeah. And to go through a bit of a gauntlet of sorts of learning to be stronger and to reclaim your true self, despite those core wounds, despite those things that have harmed you in the past. So that's about all I can say about it so far. But it's for me, it's been transformative. I just did mine in May. I had done a similar weekend with Mankind Project several years back, but I just did Illumines back in May, and my life has been different since. Like I was able to release some things that I've been holding on to for so long. There's something tangible, something about tangible ritual, about doing something that's embodied, that's physical, it's more powerful, at least for me, than just working through it in my head. Because I've been working through some of these things in my head, some grief, some things I needed to let go of, some past relationships, past career. I've been sort of an entrepreneur and building a business that fell apart during COVID. And I just needed to release some of that grief and that stuff. And no matter how much I'd gone over to my head and worked through it with my therapist, it wasn't until I went through some of these embodied rituals that it actually there was this marker of, okay, that's done now. That part of my life has passed. I've actually put to death that person that was holding on to those things. And now I'm free to be a new person.
Yeah. Because for some of my audience, the word ritual is negative.
Right.
Because, I was, I was kind of the charismatic light, rock and roll. Yeah. A little bit progressive evangelical pastor, we had women pastors, you know what I mean? And we did a lot of social justice work in the city through what we called servant evangelism and, showing God's love in practical ways to as many hurting places as we could in our city, Yeah. But I had about 30% of my people came from Catholic backgrounds. And so for them, ritual was like meaningless things that didn't help them out spiritually at all. But you're using the term ritual in a very positive sense. It's like something we actually need.
Yeah. If I could push back on that just a little bit, Fred.
Yeah, go ahead. Please. Yeah.
I grew up Baptist, so I am definitely from the tribe that was against dead ritualism, that was against all those things that those Catholics did, and probably the Lutherans and Presbyterians too, because we couldn't tell the difference. And it was bullshit, because the reality is the Baptists had just as many of their own rituals. They just didn't like to acknowledge that they did. Charismatics did, Pentecostals did. It's the way that you do things, those routines, those habits, those practices that you do over and over again. And my God, I mean, you try to move the communion table to a different spot of the sanctuary, or change the color of the carpet in the in the reception room or the nursery, or you try to not raise your hands during worship, or raise your hands during worship. I mean, whatever. As soon as you start doing things differently, you start to notice where the rituals are that people actually care about. And because and in a sense, rightly so, because rituals are important. We live our lives through rituals, getting up in the morning and brushing our teeth and taking a shit and eating our breakfast and whatever. And like that's all ritual. That's routines and practices that help us order and structure our day so that it's not just chaos. And rituals are also kind of a microcosm of reality. You do in small to illustrate or live out the things you want in large. So, their practice in a sense.
I'm totally agree with you. And my church had all of our own rituals, right? So I totally get that. And I remember reading, 10, 15 years ago, and I'm blanking on the name of it now, but it was like a psychologist book for maximum performance, like for top performance, almost kind of like a Tim Ferriss kind of idea that he's always doing top performers everywhere. And one of the questions he always asks, like, Serena Williams, the best tennis player in the world, or this person, the best this person in the world, the best this person in the world, is what are your rituals? What are the things that you get up and do every day that were the practice part that got you to where you're at? You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Do you remember the name of that book that I'm trying to think of?
Do not know that one. Yeah. Okay. I will say, I think what people don't like, it's not that they don't like rituals, that they don't like dead rituals. They don't like meaningless rituals. They want to understand, and this might be a facet of American culture. We feel like we have to own our spirituality. We feel like we have to be in control of it. Martin Marty, the great church historian, calls it the Baptistification of American Christianity. Nathan Hatch, another historian, calls it the democratization of American Christianity. It's this idea that all of us need to be, that we all want the priesthood of all believers, whether you're Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, Charismatic, that American Christians want to feel like they're in control of their own spiritual destiny. And that it's at the end of the day, it's just them and God, or them and whatever higher power or higher reality that they believe in. And so they want to know why they're doing what they're doing. And that's a very legitimate, demand. And I think churches and spiritual communities that can have ritual, but help people see what the what and the why of it, they're going to thrive.
Yeah, I'm on board with you. I'm trying to play the devil's advocate a little bit there, because people would leave a liturgical church because they never had gotten anything out of it, and then all of a sudden they find life in a charismatic church or a free church of some sort.
And so sometimes they drift back once they're old enough to do some reading for themselves and realize, oh, that's what those rituals were about. And it's a shame no one ever told them before. Or maybe they did and they weren't paying attention. I mean, I don't know how many middle school kids actually pay attention during confirmation classes. So
I know. Now I have one of my cousins that grew up Baptist, but has been Greek Orthodox now for a good chunk of his life. And, and I've had a lot of friends that have left of course, I have people who have gone everywhere, so, and even me, I've been in a meditation group, and I want to ask you about the spirituality component, the contemplative component. So, so the ritual component obviously overlaps the contemplative part, but maybe there's a little bit of a difference. I don't know, or maybe you make some of your contemplative practices rituals, but I've been in a Buddhist type meditation, a mindfulness meditation group for almost 2 years. And it's really been helpful because of my, I call it my, I think I've had an overactive amygdala my whole life. That's my insomnia. I only slept 3 hours a night for 30 years, couldn't turn my brain off. And then all the trauma that I've gone through with the losses and everything. And so I've found the meditation practices really helpful for me, to kind of try to heal my brain some. So I'm guessing you guys are incorporating, when you say contemplative, you're incorporating some of those practices of meditation and awareness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, contemplative spirituality, it's it's more or less the same thing that people mean when they talk about mindfulness meditation. There might be some differences. There can be, like, centering prayer is one of the practices. And that can be more specifically Christian, where you're focused on a specific phrase or image, and centering your thoughts, your meditative thoughts on that. But really, that's just the difference between there's two types of meditation, right? There's a meditation where you're trying to empty your mind and just focus on your breathing and just noticing the thoughts that go by, but not fixating. And then there's kind of centering meditation where you focus on a mantra or some content or a thought or a phrase or a word or a reading or an image. So, and there's both, really. So the contemplative movement, contemplative spirituality, it's analogous. It's akin to, it's a cousin of mindfulness meditation, some of the Eastern practices as well. In fact, Richard Rohr, when he talks about this, he describes it as, he places it within what's called the perennial tradition, which is a thing that religion scholars like me talk about as a movement that tries to look at what are the common themes and practices across lots of religions and lots of spiritual traditions. What are the common themes, the common practices, the things that they all sort of do, and so in order to find some common ground, but also to say these are the tried and true methods. These are the things that humans have been doing for thousands of years. The technologies, if you will, spiritual technologies that have been tested, that have been demonstrated to work, to do, what that's what I love about Buddhism is, you ask a Buddhist, like, why should I believe in Buddhism? And they'll say, well, just try it and see. And if it doesn't work for you, then don't, like, it's a very experimental kind of philosophy, religion, whatever you want to call it, because it's about those practices. And so, for me, that's what prayer is these days. Prayer is meditation. And for me specifically, mindfulness meditation in the sense of noticing, because my theology, insofar as I have one, of God is beyond just mystery, is that God is immanent, that God is everywhere, that everything, the world exists within God, as 1 Corinthians, in him we live and move and have our being, everything does. And so if I want to connect with God, if I want to communicate with God, if I want to notice the divine and notice that divine reality, all I have to do is notice. All I have to do is wake up to open my eyes and pay attention. And all of a sudden I start to see all the things that I was missing in the first place, all the things that were there the whole time. And I just didn't know, because I wasn't paying attention. This is why the theme of we have an annual men's conference called Solarize. It's coming up beginning of November in New Mexico. And the theme for this year is Awaken, because more than anything, it's so simple, but that's kind of what we need to do, is just to wake up.
Now, is that different than the rites of passage, the solar,
Yeah. So the rites of passage, even though you're doing it in a group, it's a very personal experience. It's your own personal rites of passage. And it's sort of an initiation first kind of sort of thing. Solarize is more communal. It's a men's gathering. It's coming together with lots of other men still to do intensive inner work. It's not speakers and workshops and that kind of thing. It's intensive inner spiritual work, but it's a little more of a nationwide corporate gathering, bring everyone together. So it'll be, several hundred people. And if his health is up to it, we're hoping Richard Rohr will be able to join us. We haven't been able to confirm that yet, but he has in the past. Every year he comes and reconnects with us.
Right.
So the men rites of passage, it's 40, 50, 60 guys, and you're doing it kind of in this smaller, more personal vein, but really you can do it in either order. So if people are curious about Illumin, come to Solarize, see what we're about, and then decide if you want to do this more intensive rite of passage.
Yeah. I'm curious too, like, let's say, with all of the gender inclusive language that we try to use now. And, I have a really close friend that's a trans woman. So I'm curious, like, I'm sure she will listen to this, and I'll be curious to have a conversation with her about this, but I'm curious too, like what if you had a trans man show up at one of your Lumen events?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One that we've raised, we've been working through, because this is new to a lot of us, and a lot of us are learning how to talk about this and be more inclusive in ways that work and make sense and that don't leave anyone out. And I mean, I just even personally, I've had to figure this out more recently. My youngest child came out as trans about a year ago. And so I've had to learn, what are the right ways to talk about this and think about this. So for Illumin, what we do is we just say all male identified persons are welcome. If you identify as a man, you are welcome to come. And then that's up to you. We leave it up to the individual to decide, does this feel like a place that's right for me?
Right.
So yeah, a trans man would absolutely be welcome. A non-binary person that identifies more on the masculine end, or would feel comfortable in a group of men doing men's work. Absolutely. It's up to that individual whether they feel comfortable. We don't yet have programs for women or trans women or, femme identified persons. And that's just kind of, we can only do so much. And there's already a lot of great organizations out there working with women. And so we don't want to presumptuously assume that what we have is going to be good for them too. If a group of women wanted to come and say, hey, we want to adapt what you're doing, that would be wonderful. But so far, unfortunately, we don't have stuff for that side of thing. We do work specifically with male identified folks, but any male identified folks.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Wow. So you've got the Illumin is a great website. How would people connect with you, Mike? The
best way to dip a toe in is through our virtual councils, or through our local chapters. So we have over a dozen official chapters all around the country. And we have about a dozen more smaller kind of just getting going groups. So if you happen to be near one of them, just go to our, illumin.org/chapters, I think, and that'll give you state by state list, or even country by country. We have like 7 different countries that have men's work groups that were inspired by Richard Rohr's work. And if you aren't near one of those, we have virtual councils that meet every week, sometimes multiple times a week, that you can dip into. And by council, we mean it's basically a small group practice. It's a method or a mode of going deep, being authentic with a small group of men. It's sharing from the heart, listening from the heart, no crosstalk, no giving advice and back and forth, just sharing and listening, lean of speech. It's not a time for people to, share their whole life story, but really just to get to the point. So, come and show up to one of those virtual councils and just see what it's like to sit in a group of men who are dedicated to doing their inner work, that are dedicated to being authentic and real with one another. We just also launched what's called passion circles, which are kind of virtual councils that are focused on a particular theme. So we have one that's working through a book called The Hidden Spirituality of Men by Matthew Fox. We have one that's working through Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. We have a group for divorce recovery. We have a group for GBTQ men called the Rainbow Council. We have a group for ministers and pastors and spiritual caregivers to connect around their shared experiences, a bunch more. So,
okay.
So yeah, that would be the best way to connect, is either in person, if you can find one, or online. And then, if you like what you see, come to Solarize. Join us out in New Mexico in November.
Yeah. Now, is Matthew Fox the guy that wrote Original Blessing?
Yes.
The same guy? Okay. I read Original Blessing. I love that. I thought he did a great job on that. And I ended up learning, and another book I just found recently was The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron.
Yes. Yeah.
She gives credit. Her early days were very influenced by Matthew Fox and the recovery world.
Yes.
And of course, Rohr. So I've been in the recovery community for about 3 years. And of course, one of the early Rohr books I read was Breathing Underwater, which is his take on the 12-step stuff. And honestly, I just, I got it. I'd been on Xanax and alcohol for about 2.5 years, which wasn't helpful for my brain. But in the healing process, I now lost all my community. And so where I found community was in the recovery. And I've been really networked broadly with the recovery world here in Kansas City. And the thing I loved about it was the honesty, the humility, and the vulnerability. And then I like the fact that the broad spirituality was inclusive of anybody. You could pretty much find some place to land. Even if you were an atheist agnostic, you could find a toehold somewhere in the recovery world,
Yeah. We have there's a lot of similarities between what recovery folks, 12-step folks do and what our counsels are like.
Okay.
Just in that terms of that, sharing and listening. And that's sort of the point and the power of it, to really hear and be heard. And we do actually, one of our passion circles is called Male and On, and it's for 12-step folks that want to gather with other men. Okay. But,
I hit most of the recovery meetings at Wild Goose. It was, and I lead a few groups like that, and I lead some AA meetings, but I also lead just groups for non-addict alcoholics, but they're very much patterned after that, like in-person groups here in Kansas City. So, but I love it,
I think that there's another point of analogy too, where one of Illumin's taglines is "Men transforming men through a power greater than ourselves," and that focus on that power greater than ourselves. I've heard before, from folks outside of 12 steps that they don't. Sometimes that can feel disempowering, and maybe encourages folks to not take responsibility. But I don't really see it that way. I see it as more of that path of dissent. That path of letting go of that need to always be in control and to always, do it through our own willpower. That comes that point in our life where whatever it is you're struggling with, your willpower isn't enough, and you need to kind of just surrender and say, I can't do this. I'm going to need some help. Mm-hmm. And
that surrender piece of spirituality seems to resonate in most traditions, right? In some form or fashion.
Yeah.
And certainly in the addict alcoholic world. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, who was it that first century Jewish rabbi that said, anyone who wants to, the first shall be last and last shall be first. And anyone who wants to, enter the kingdom needs to, give up everything they have and become as a little child. I'm mashing up a few different verses, but there's this theme of surrender, even in, those traditional religions. It's not a surrender, your responsibility. And it's not a surrender, just to follow blindly some leader that's going to tell you what to do. It's more surrender to surrender that false self and the egoic self, so that you can get in touch with the part of yourself that never lost touch with the spirit, that never lost touch with your that core inner being. Like you said, you can interpret that through an atheist lens or through a religious lens, however you like, where that higher power is inside you or outside of you or whatever. There's something that we're missing, and that only comes through surrender.
Yeah.
I found anyway.
Yeah. I'm still surrendering. Right. Yeah. Well, good. All right. So give us the website one more time.
It's illumin.org, ILLUMAN.org. All
right. And then they can go on some kind of library WorldCat thing and read your dissertation.
Probably by now. Yeah. Yeah.
Or do you have some books out there?
No, nothing that most of your folks would be interested in. I published one anthology of scholarship on the emerging church movement, but I've not published the dissertation yet. But I do think if you dig deep enough in a academic archive, you probably find it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like what are they? I forgot them already. WorldCat or what are
the ones? Just if people are actually interested in my academic work, go to academia.edu and they can shoot me an email through that, and I'll be happy to, release a copy.
Yeah.
I'll warn people though, it's almost 600 pages long. So it's not,
Right.
It's good for putting you to sleep at night. You said you had some sleep problems. Maybe just try reading my dissertation.
Right. Yeah, it's better than Xanax and alcohol. That's my advice anyway. So.
Puts me to sleep, and I wrote it.
Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us on Spirituality Adventures. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation, Fred. And hope to see you at some Illumin stuff sometime.
I hope so. So,
or if not, at the next Wild Goose anyway.
Yeah, I really enjoyed my time there. So that was fun. And I wrote down my list of people I wanted to stay connected to. You were one of them. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning into Spirituality Adventures. And we will see you next time. Take care.
This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.